Hello, everybody.
Hello.
I want to say hello to those who join us on social media. Some are not able to come in person. I'm so glad about this technology that you can take care of everybody all at the same time. So it's good to be able to do that. My name is Antonio Neely. Like I tell everybody, I'm the proud pastor of the Pleasant Green Baptist Church, nestled here in the beautiful metropolis that is Portsmouth, Ohio. And so I'm excited to come to you today as well as Dr. Fight. We're going to give you a community update on all the work we're doing as it relates to Underground Railroad. So I'm just excited. If you don't see my face, I'm going to be the one that's manning the camera sometimes, and I'm going to be Dr. Fight going to be tag teaming back and forth. At the end, we're going to go through the presentation, and at the end, I do ask if it's possible to have ask all the questions at the end until we get through the entire presentation. There's a lot of great things we want to show you and stuff like that in the work that we're doing. So I wanted to ask that you hold off from any questions that you might have to the absolute very end.
Yeah, if you can. It's a little slow. So if you see the number up.
Bill, okay. Okay.
Hit the arrow.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Andrew Fight, Professor of History at Shawnee State University. I'm also the Director of Research and Outreach for the Appalachian Freedom Heritage Tourism Initiative for the Tri-State region. It's quite a mouthful. We call it, for short, the Appalachian Freedom Initiative. But this is a federally funded grant program from the Appalachian Regional Commission. It is what's called a power grant. And you can see, our partners in this project are the Appalachian Regional Commission, the National Park Service, Lawrence Economic Development Corporation, Shawnee State, and Marshall University. Next slide. So the power grants, again, this is a federal program. It stands for Partnerships for Opportunity and Workforce and Economic Revitalization, or POWER. These are federal grants that are targeted to help communities that are dealing with the loss of coal mining jobs, coal power plant jobs, coal-related supply chain industries in the region that we've seen a loss of jobs this few decades. And so these grants are meant to try to assist economic development in the Appalachian region. Our grant, you go on to the next slide. Oh, Gary?
Hi, buddy.
So there are a bunch of partners that are part of this grant. And our grant area covers 9 counties. So we've got a list of our partners here. We can go ahead to the next slide. You can see the counties that the grant is focused on. So it's in the tri-state area. We've got 9 counties that we're doing research on the Underground Railroad for, and ultimately developing a new driving tour of historical sites. So we're working in Brown, Adams, Scioto, Lawrence, and Gallia County, in Greenup and Boyd County in Kentucky, Wayne and Cabell County in West Virginia. So the project will create a website, and the website's already live, so you can check it out. There's not a lot of content on it yet, but this is where the new tour will be located. It's AppalachianFreedom.com, and we can go on to the next slide. But basically, what you'll have is a website with 27 locations that are connected to 27 sites in the tri-state. Each site will have a historical marker. That marker will have a QR code on it, so you can take your mobile phone, take a snapshot of the QR code, and then it will take you to website for that historical site, and then you'll be able to access multimedia content about the history of that Underground Railroad site. And so these are the 27 sites that, after our research, that we've settled on. It's really been quite an experience researching. It's been an amazing sort of process of discovery. And while we have 27 sites, I will say that we've probably found 60 sites or more, really. And so there are already our wheels turning for a second phase, another round of grant funding that we hope to secure so we can add even more sites in Scioto County, more sites in all 9 counties, plus add some additional counties like Mason County, West Virginia, Lewis, and Mason County, Kentucky. Okay, thanks. So you can see that there are 4 sites here in Portsmouth, and believe me, it's really difficult to narrow these down, and you know, it's frustrating not to be able to mark more. But what we decided was that we would mark Pleasant Green Baptist Church, Allen Chapel, the AME Church, Portsmouth First Presbyterian Church, and then the residence of James Ashley. So the churches are where the network to freedom, or the Underground Railroad, you know, really kind of crossed. It's where the people that were part of the network acted with each other. And so you can talk about multiple conductors and station masters and things like this for each of the churches. And so what you do is you start by marking the churches, and then get additional markers. We can go out and start marking other locations, you know, for example, related to John J. Minor, a conductor, for example. He was a member of Allen Chapel, and so we could tell his story through Allen Chapel, but we also know where his barber shop was, right? So if we had another marker, we would put a marker there, right? So those are the 4 that we'll be marking here in Scioto County in this initial phase. Go ahead, next slide. And this is a map that shows you the 27 sites. So basically, you know, from Ripley here in Brown County, going upriver, you have sites in Adams County, and then you get into Portsmouth and Scioto County, and there's sites in Greenup, and then down into Boyd County, and then over into what's Wayne County, West Virginia, Serrata, and then over on the Ohio side, you've got Ironton and Burlington and Proctorville. And then upriver here is a place called Green Bottle in West Virginia, but it was one of the largest plantations in West Virginia. And we're marking it as an escape site for a man named Moses, who we've been able to document having escaped from Green Bottle. And then up into Gallipolis, we're marking the AME Church in Gallipolis. And then on the outside of Anderson, you know, back behind Gallipolis, you've got a place called Porter. Today it's like Bidwell. There was a post office here. The guy who ran the post office was an Underground Railroad conductor agent, and then actually the whole neighborhood was a group of Underground Railroad conductors. And then just outside of Porter, or even just a little bit behind Porter, is a place called the Lambert Lands, which was an African American settlement established by a group of African Americans that were emancipated, and their former owner, slaver, bought like 240 some acres and deeded it to them communally, and so they done it in a sort of communal fashion. Let's see. So that's nine counties. Really, there's sort of three parts to the tour. It would take you really 3 days to do it. And this later in June, the National Park Service is coming, and we're going to be running them through this tour over 3 days. Okay, so just back to that, you can see the list here. So the Amy Chapel in Gallipolis that I mentioned is called the John G. Black Historical Center today. But it is the former John G. Amy Chapel. And so in Portsmouth, just to show you the map here, that where the markers would go initially. Okay, so our biggest partner in all this ultimately is the National Park Service. And they have a program called the National Underground Railroad Network of Freedom. And the program is similar to the National Register for Historic Places, which you may have heard about. You know, like, hey, is that on the National Register? Okay, that's the National Register for Historic Places. The National Register requires that you have the original structure, right? So that and that it actually looked like it used to look like, right? It can't be all modified. So the program for the Underground Railroad is a special program that allows locations where the historical architecture no longer exists. Okay, and so what that does, it opens up the possibility of marking places connected to the Underground Railroad, because so many of those places have been lost to quote unquote progress over the years. Okay. So it's important to work with the definition that the National Park Service uses, because we basically, the work we're doing is to nominate these sites to the National Park Service, right? Say, hey, we verified this is really, a site that's connected to Underground Railroad activity. Well, what is the Underground Railroad? So the way that the National Park Service defines it is resistance to enslavement through escape and flight, which includes freedom seekers and those who assisted them in their efforts to escape from enslavement. So you keep that in mind, and you keep your thoughts focused on the freedom seeker, right? That's really the key to accessing all this history. So a quick rundown on Underground Railroad, right? Runaways. You see this term used more frequently today, freedom seekers, rather than calling these people slaves, right? So freedom seekers. But freedom seekers relied upon a network of allies, both black and white, that would help move or direct them onto the next safe location or station. And you'll see that the terminology is connected to the actual railroad industry, right? So, you have stations, you have lines, you have conductors, you have agents, like ticket agents, right? Routes. In some places, you had presidents of the local railroad, even, which would be the person that was kind of overseeing and directing a lot of the activity, and in some cases funding a lot of the activity. One thing that a lot of people don't think of at first about the Underground Railroad is that it costs money to operate the Underground Railroad. And so money actually truly was needed to buy clothes, to buy tickets on stagecoaches, to buy tickets on actual railroads, even to purchase weapons to arm the freedom seekers. So over time, these networks and routes become known as the Underground Railroad. And by the 1850s, it was the common term that was used. Ultimately, what's important to remember is that it was illegal all the activity involved with the Underground Railroad was illegal. The freedom seeker was a fugitive, like we think of today, right? They're on the run. The law could grab them at any moment. Okay, those who helped them are aiding and abetting the fugitive, right? So there are state laws, there are federal laws, and that's what made it underground, because it was illegal. And one of the things that I think is becoming clear to all of us that are researching this is that, like with organized crime, it's often kept within the family. And so what you actually find are these amazing genealogical connections, because the network was often very much a family network.
That's right. It's still recording.
Okay. So what we're looking at here is the National Underground Railroad Network of Freedom listings. And you can see across the United States the different sites that have been listed. And I think it says 98 for Ohio and 97 for Maryland. So Ohio is leading the way in the listings. Again, pointing to how important Ohio is as a crossroads for the Underground Railroad. One thing I'll say is, if you go back real quick, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
If you look at West Virginia and Kentucky, Tennessee, come on, Tennessee, you got 5, right? 2 in West Virginia. Well, we're planning to add, I think, 3 or 4 to West Virginia in our project. So those numbers are going to be going up, and we're also adding to Ohio. So we're going to keep Ohio in the lead. So these are the type of sites that can be listed. Stations like safe houses, escape sites. That's where the freedom seeker first ran away or escaped from. So escape sites often are plantations, but in Kentucky, one of the escape sites we're looking at is our furnace sites, because there was industrial slavery, which is a lot of people think of slaves were always working in the field, or in the house as a house servant. But in eastern Kentucky, in the area along the river where we live here, there actually were a number of iron furnaces in Kentucky, and their labor force was, in one instance, we think it was up to 60% slave labor that was running the furnaces. So the furnaces in Greenup County, Boyd County, Kentucky, they become escape sites. Churches, as we've talked about, are where the network comes together in many instances. Cemeteries where conductors are buried or freedom seekers are buried can be marked. In the future, I think we can mark Soldiers Circle and Green Lawn, because there are at least 2 freedom conductors buried in Soldiers Circle. Green Lawn as a whole, there's probably 10 or 15. I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating. I think a dozen. Kidnapping site. These are where free African Americans were kidnapped and basically re-enslaved. Kidnapped in Ohio and re-enslaved. So kidnapping sites can be marked. A rescue site. This would be a freedom seeker who had been captured, but then community members basically overwhelmed the people that were holding them in jail or whatever and broke them out of jail. That's a rescue site. Destination. We're looking at marking Portsmouth as a destination, the steamboat landing of Portsmouth as a destination, because we've been able to find so many different stories of people coming to Portsmouth Yeah, that was their destination in Ohio, was to get to Portsmouth. Then from Portsmouth, they could get on the Underground Railroad. Military site, we've got one of these that we're looking at, really two, I guess. But that would be during the Civil War, where freedom seekers came over to Union camps seeking freedom. And they were considered contraband, but that was before the Emancipation Proclamation. After the Emancipation Proclamation, they could enlist in the military. Legal challenge, this would be people suing for their freedom, or people being prosecuted for helping freedom seekers. And in Greenup County, we've actually found both. Men and women, African American women and men who sued for their freedom, and we have at least one or two cases where they won. One of them was overturned on appeal. So for that, we're looking at marking the Greenup County Courthouse, because that's where those court cases were held back in the 1850s. A maroon community, this is not really common around here, but like down in Florida and the swampy areas where the Seminoles were, you had runaway black communities living with Native Americans and stuff like that out in the middle of swamps and stuff like that. So that's a maroon community. Transportation route, that would be basically you could say the main route out of Portsmouth could be considered a transportation route. So a route that which freedom seekers were regularly taking. Archaeological site, where there's archaeological research that's been done on an Underground Railroad sort of site, a hiding place or something like that. If it's associated with a prominent person, so that would be a prominent abolitionist or Underground Railroad operator. You can actually do a whole historic district. This is something that Ripley is looking at, because they have so many different Underground Railroad sites in their historic district. They're thinking about actually having their historic district marked as a Underground Railroad Network of Freedom site. And then a commemorative site or monument. So there's a monument to the memory of a freedom seeker, for example, that could be marked. And we're actually looking to do something like that in Ashland. The Armco Park and the Ashland County government, they're looking at actually building a monument so that we can mark it. We could put a marker in Armco Park for a guy named Asbury Parker who escaped from Clinton Furnace, which was about a mile from Armco Park. So I'm getting ready to call you up here. Other ways you get listed on the network is if it's an educational program, a research facility, a historical tour. So ultimately, I would argue that our tour itself is going to be placed on the network of freedom. So just keep going. So once you get listed, it does actually open up some grant funding. And so that's one of the things that Pleasant Green and Allen Chapel, they would actually have some access to some National Park Service grant funding to assist with preservation as well as educational programs. Okay. So I got two paintings I want to show y'all as a way to sort of start our larger discussion here. This is a famous painting, 1893. It depicts Levi Coffin up here and his wife here, or here. I'm not really sure which one she is, honestly. But it's a group of freedom seekers that are being assisted by white Underground Railroad operators, conductors. This is the painting that inspired a historian from Ohio State University to basically become the expert on the Underground Railroad that he became in the 1890s, and it led him to go out and interview people that had been involved in the Underground Railroad. And it's why we know so much about the network here in Portsmouth, because that professor, Wilbur Siebert, came to Portsmouth and interviewed John J. Miner and others. But this is sort of a depiction of the Underground Railroad that kind of focuses on the role that white people played in an interracial, cooperation. Go to the next slide. And that was painted in 1893. This was painted in 1864 during the time of the Civil War. The date actually is 1862. I'm not sure why the dates are flipped there like that, but 1862. This is a family of freedom seekers on horseback by themselves, fleeing, escaping, resisting slavery, right, seeking liberty. This was actually probably a much more common sort of as part of the journey, if you want to think of it like that. That it wasn't always white people helping. Oftentimes in the earliest parts of escapes, they were alone. But somebody maybe gave them that horse, or maybe they stole that horse. But ultimately, it's really, if you can combine these two historic images and think of the Underground Railroad as really based upon interracial cooperation, but it also was very much an African American run network. And this is the part of the history that it's not often emphasized enough, I'll say. So go ahead. One of the things that we're trying to do with our work is to correct this map, because this map is a really common map. There's a couple versions I'll show you, but it shows you the major routes of the Underground Railroad. And where we are here, it looks like there wasn't anything going on. But if you think about it, Virginia is a slave state. Kentucky is a slave state. There were slaves living all throughout this area. Their route to run away was right through the tri-state. So by mapping what we're mapping and getting this history literally on the map, we're going to change the map. And people will know about the Underground Railroad here in southern Ohio and eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. Okay. So that's the National Geographic Society, and this is the National Park Service, right? So even they, but they can only work with the research that has been done, and our history has been neglected. Now, Professor Siebert, this is his map from 1898, and if you go back to that, it's like, hey, look, Siebert knew it. Look, he's got routes from Portsmouth, from Ironton, Gallipolis. Okay. Next slide. There's another version of one of his maps, showing you all the lines in our neck of the woods. Okay. Next. And so this is the network to freedom sites currently, and you can see that there's only really kind of one site that's currently on the network. It's actually, there's really 3 sites, or 4, you might say, if you go over to Brown County, because Ripley has been marked. Go to the next slide. So, like in Lawrence County, you do have that one. It's Macedonia Baptist Church, the oldest Black Baptist church in Ohio. The John Rankin and John P. Parker houses in Ripley, and then in Adams County there is the Wicker Hand Inn. But all of this has yet to be marked on the Network of Freedom. Okay. And I think that's ultimately why we got funded. When you look at the map, we just don't have the resources in our local historical societies to pay for the kind of research that needs to be done to do this, to mark this. And that's why this federal money is so important. Okay, so you can see that's what we're adding. Okay, next. So that's Siebert. It came to Ironton, Lawrence County in 1893 and Portsmouth in 1894. Okay. And so these are the things that we're going to kind of emphasize of what we've sort of learned and why you can say this is like new light. The key role of free black communities and churches. I can't emphasize that enough, and I think you'll see that in the presentation. The key role of black barbers in river towns like Portsmouth. The key role of women, black and white. The key role of interracial cooperation. And then lastly, multiple modes of transportation, right? These folks are moving about on steamboats, on railroads, on horseback, on foot, on carriages, you know. Okay. So the key role of free black communities and churches. Next slide. So you can see Allen Chapel here, established 1837, Pleasant Green, or Shiloh, circa 1852. If you go back to the beginning, Macedonia Baptist Church in Burlington, Lawrence County, it's down by South Point, if you don't know where Burlington is. Macedonia Church is on the hill, basically back on the river hills behind South Point or Burlington down there. John G. Was originally known as Bethel in Gallipolis, 1818. Black Fork Union Baptist Church in Poke Patch, Lawrence County, 1819. Quinn Chapel, AME in Chillicothe, 1821. First Baptist Church, Chillicothe, 1824. Eden Baptist in the PP settlement, Pike County, 1824. Paint Creek, Gallipolis, Paint Creek Baptist in Gallipolis, 1833. Allen Chapel, Pleasant Green, and then Quinn Chapel AME in Ironton, 1856. But yeah, so each of these churches represents a black community in these counties. And you can kind of see at what point there was a large enough black community for them to start forming their own churches, and, you know, by these dates. Okay, next. So here in Portsmouth, I'll hand it over to Reverend Neely to pick up the story with the AME Church here in Portsmouth.
Okay, what you're going to find with the just give you a brief synopsis real quickly. The AME Church was the original founder was a slave that paid for his freedom, then ultimately paid for the freedom of his own family. So every church that comes out of the AME Church has a tradition based off of abolition, freedom of slavery, and all those different things. So what you're going to find is a lot of AME churches along the rivers, Ohio River, which they consider the River Jordan. If anybody knows the Bible, the River Jordan is where you cross over for the slave. You crossing over for the next slide. You got Allen Chapel, organized 1837. This is what Portsmouth looked like around 1846. You can go next slide. It's not a whole lot there. Portsmouth's black community played a central role in the operation of the Underground Railroad in Scioto County. What you're going to find is you'll find a lot of conductors, a lot of freedom seekers. It's a whole gamut of those who were connected to the Underground Railroad that were members of Allen Chapel, which becomes Allen Chapel Railroad. This is a picture of one of the first houses of worship for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which becomes ultimately it becomes Allen Chapel. Next slide. This is another picture that was on Fifth Street, which was built in 1844, which is 7 years after that previous church. It was called the Colored Church on Fifth Street, 1844. Next slide. This is another picture. This is where it becomes Allen Chapel. We know it's Allen Chapel at this point, circa around 1870 on 7th Street. Next slide. Okay. In 1893, in September 1893, they met at a conference here in Portsmouth on 7th Street. You're going to find a lot of famous, well-known AME members that were at this particular conference that were members of Allen Chapel. Next slide. I'm going to point out a few of them to you in just a few minutes. And this is now where Allen Chapel's present location on Waller Street, right next door, right up the street. Next slide. This is where I went down to the recorder. We were doing some research on Pleasant Green Baptist Church as well as Allen Chapel. Me and Miss Gail was looking over property records, looking at it and see how all of these things connect as it relates to the Underground Railroad. Next slide. Now look, if you notice, this is the progression. It started out over here. And if you notice about anything about Portsmouth, most of the black community was north of everything else. And so it steady progressed and moved northward. It started here, then it moved to 5th Street, then it moved to 7th Street, then it moved to 12th Street. Next slide. I put this in here. This is Joseph headstone, a green lawn of Joseph Love. He was a member of AME Allen Chapel. He was also one of what Seaver writes about in his article as it relates to the Underground Railroad, Green Lawn Cemetery. And it's actually, if you go there, you'll see his tombstone. And Joseph Love also served in the Civil War as well. He was on the 27th Ohio Colored Infantry. And after the Civil War, Joseph Love settled here in Portsmouth with his wife, Martha, and they raised a son and a daughter. Next slide. Methodist elder John Q. Weaver, he was a barber. That's major as it relates to the Underground Railroad. Guess what? A popular place where everybody went to is where? The barber shop. Everybody gonna get their hair cut. Everybody gonna go to beautician. The ladies gonna get their hair done. And so ultimately, the barbershop became an easy place that they can pass information along without anybody knowing about it. John Q. Weaver was one of those barbers. He was a conductor. Here's his picture again. He was born free in North Carolina and was named in honor of President John Q. Adams. He served in the Mexican War. He was a barber on the Bostona. That's something we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Also, he was a treasurer on the Portsmouth Trinity Live. He was a Black Mason. He did some very historic. He was the first African American elected in public office in Portsmouth. So he was major as it relates to not only the Underground Railroad, but his African American history in general. Next slide. Here's an article about John Q. Weaver. Look what it says. It was located on Chillicothe Street, north of 10th Street, and for years was the home of John Q. Weaver, a Negro barber in Portsmouth. Older residents recall the fact that when slaves made their way to Portsmouth, Weaver hid them in his home. And then undercover in darkness, they moved them to Piketon, to Columbus, to Cleveland, and then to Canada. He hid slaves. He was a barber owner. So he got the message, and he hid the slaves and made sure they got to ultimately to Canada. Next slide. Next slide. That's John Q. Weaver right there on the end. He was at that conference in September 1893. Next slide. That's another picture of John Q. Weaver.
Zoom in one more time.
One more click. There we go. We looked at him a couple times to make sure it was him. And we discovered, yeah, it's him. There's no doubt about it. That's John Q. Weaver. There's no doubt about it. That was him. Next slide. The Free Black Communities AME Church in Appalachia, Ohio. You got the John G. AME Church. You have the Quinn Chapel AME Church in Chillicothe, Allen Chapel AME Church in Portsmouth, and you got the Quinn Chapel AME Church. One of the things I want to point out is you got two churches that are named by the same, basically the same name but different location. One reason why I point that out is many of the AME churches are named after those persons that are very synonymous within the AME church tradition. William Quinn is the person that they're named after. And of course, he was a person that was integral in the Underground Railroad, as well as he went around the country setting up churches all over the United States. Next slide. Black Baptist beginnings in Appalachia, Ohio. Next slide. Just as much as the AME churches were intricate in the Underground Railroad, you had the Black Baptist churches that were intricate, a part of Underground Railroad. We have, of course, we've already talked about Macedonian Baptist Church in Burlington, which is already has some marks. We also have Black Fork in Polk Patch in Lawrence County. We have First Baptist Chillicothe, which is, and then we have Eden Baptist in the PP settlement. Don't laugh at that name. Don't laugh at the name. Don't laugh at the name. But we have Plain Creek Baptist Church in Gallipolis, Gallia County, and then Pleasant Green, Shiloh. We put in parentheses Shiloh for a reason, and I'm going to point it out in just a few minutes. Portsmouth, Scioto, estimate circa 815-52. Macedonian Baptist Church in Burlington, Lawrence County. The Craddock family and his family was among the founders of Macedonian Baptist Church. Also served as Shiloh Anti-Slavery Missionary Baptist Church in Portsmouth, which became known later as Pleasant Green Baptist Church. We have what's so interesting in our research. We found a descendant of Jonathan Craddock that's here at Pleasant Green Baptist Church. If y'all know Debbie Lawson, she can trace her history back then. She's related to them.
She's a Cradoff.
She was Cradoff. Yep.
And the Cradoffs and Craddocks and Tradoffs are all from the same family.
Avondale Madison was a Cradoff.
Yeah.
She's from Black Fork.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You see how all these things connected? It's kind of families know each other and they started. Go ahead, next slide. We have Providence Anti-Baptist Slavery Association. It was started in 1834. It was part of the Tees Baptist Association. They broke away from the Tees Baptist Association of Virginia over the issue of slavery. That association felt that their members could have slaves. This association said you cannot have slaves and be a Christian. And so they broke away from Tees Valley Baptist Association. It came to include congregations from Scioto, Lawrence, Gallia, Meigs, Jackson, Peck, Ross, and Hamilton counties. And ultimately, those churches that are part of this anti-slavery association becomes major places to house slaves, major places to get slaves to freedom. Next slide. Shiloh Anti-Slavery Missionary Baptist Church in Portsmouth, Ohio, organized circa 1852. Next slide. Providence Anti-Baptist Association. This is a meeting in 1857 in August. You have this is a main meeting that only church it has in there is Shiloh, Portsmouth. What we know in records, there was no other church in Baptist Church, Black Baptist Church in Portsmouth other than Shiloh that we know of. You see down there Shiloh Church of Portsmouth, Pastor Jonathan Cradoff, War Mission, right there. Next slide. Then what we have in 1864, we have the city council proceeding where they granted Colored Baptist Church use of 7th Street Engine House for worship services. April 4th, 1862. You have Shiloh, 1852. Then you have, in 10 years later, this all they say is Colored Baptist Church use of 7th Street Engine Station. If I'm not mistaken, that engine station is still there. April 4th, 1862.
Across from Torloca.
Right across the street from Torloca.
Full story.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
That's right. The full story.
Pleasant Green Baptist Church of Portsmouth, Ohio, organized in 1864. Next slide. This is the original building, organized 1864, built in 1865. See the progression? You have Shiloh, then you in 1860. Shiloh, then you have a Colored Baptist, and then you have Pleasant Green. Organized 1864, built in 1865. So notice remember the same map we saw earlier about Allen Chapel. Allen Chapel started here, moved here, moved here. We have the same progression. We have the 7th Street here, then that original location for Pleasant Green, 10th Street, and then you have Waller Street. They follow the same progression for both churches.
It's the center of the community, right? As the community shifts northward, as the city grew, the center of the community moved, and the churches moved with it.
Right. One of the first things they do, the community grow large enough, and they build a church. One of the first things, they get large enough, and they have a church. What's interesting, though, is in between the time of the 1862 and all that, in between that time, due to black laws pushing the blacks African Americans out of Portsmouth, further out in the Houston Hollow, and then they come back in that community over there, which becomes the North End. That's where North End comes from. It's black laws pushed them out because of the issue of slavery, get to Houston Hollow, and then the black community comes back, and many of them settle in what becomes the North End. Next slide. Here's the church today. Next slide. That's another picture. I don't know who that is, but I don't know who that is. Okay. So what?
I was gonna say, Houston Hollow, 3/4 of the people that I knew when I was a child, they belong to Pleasant Green Baptist Church. Miss Sadie Hill, Grandma Hill, Doc Hurd, Miss Lucy Hanson, all these people, they belong right here. In Pleasant Green.
And we finna show. And we're glad you said that. We're finna show the connection just a minute. Nielsen Evans reports Pleasant Green Baptist Church organized 1864. Butler Harper, dedicated on 1865 Finley and 10th Streets. We finna show you the connection. Go ahead. Next slide. Here are some of the original members of Pleasant Green Baptist Church. Right there, Butler Harper was the pastor. Frank Washington, we're going to talk about Frank Washington in a few minutes. But those are a few of them right there. Next slide. A little bit of information about Butler Harper. He was a slave, born in 1811, ordained in 1836. He was in prison 5 times for preaching the gospel to his fellow slaves. He, somewhere around 1862, 1863, he left Virginia and he ultimately settles in Portsmouth. And he helps to organize what becomes Pleasant Green. Served at 17 years, moved to Kansas. His brother was also here. He passed away in 1896. Next slide. As late of 1870, Pleasant Green Baptist Church was also known as the Anti-Slavery Missionary Baptist Church, located in Portsmouth, Ohio. It was known as, how we know? Yeah, Butler Harper, we know, was the founder. And then it says in this article, Anti-Slavery Missionary Baptist Church in Portsmouth, Ohio. Next slide. Frank Washington was Butler Harper's brother, and he spoke out at the state of Ohio's Colored Men Convention. He believed in emancipation, and he was a leader in it. He helped organize state convention in Cincinnati, and worked as night watchman on the side of the courthouse. And he was also a longtime member of Trinity Lodge 9. That's major because you have John J. Minor, you have John Q. Weaver, all a part of this Network to Freedom, were also members of the Masons. Go ahead, next slide. Don Dickerson, one of the other members, was a barber. That's major. Barbara was the one that got all the information, getting them back and forth, slaves from Kentucky to Ohio to Canada. Next slide. This is just in 1930, they did an Emancipation Day, June 16th, which becomes Juneteenth, and it was held at Pleasant Green Baptist Church. Next slide. Black Baptists and Methodists and the Free Baptist Church of Houston Hollow, tracing the regular line of Portsmouth, Ohio's Underground Railroad. You want me to go? You want to take it?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Relevant.
Okay. Here we're going to show you the connection of what you just talked about in Houston Hollow. You have Little Zion Baptist Church of Davis Station, Scioto County, Ohio. Next slide. Davis County of Norfolk and Western Railway, Scioto County, Ohio. In 1890, Pleasant Green Baptist Church became affiliated with a Baptist congregation known as Little Zion, which were held at Davis Station and served the black community near Houston Hollow. Next slide. Let me show you the connection. There it is right there. Up there on the map. When they pushed them out, they developed a church in Houston Hollow. Next slide.
Isn't there a section out there on 23 now called Davis Camp?
Yes, it's the exact same area.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. There used to be a train station. That's why we call it Davis
Uh-huh.
Station, but it's Davis Camp.
Okay. Reverend Addison Haley. The reason why that's important, he was the pastor also of Pleasant Green and the Little Zion Baptist Church of Davis Station and Scioto County. The members of Zion Baptist Church of Davis County will picnic near that church tomorrow, and in the evening they will give a supper in the church. They invite all their friends to come out and spend the day with them. Next slide. The reason why I put that there is this guy is the son of Addison Haley. Why is that important? He was also a barber. He was also active in the church at Pleasant Green. But watch this. He was intricately a part of the founding what becomes the 14th Street Community Center. And remember, John J. Minor was also a barber. Next slide. John J. and Martha Minor. Next slide. Siebert comes to Portsmouth, has an interview with John J. Minor. And in that interview, he talks about Dan Lucas, Joseph Love, which is also a member of Allen Chapel. He talks about how they were able to get them to freedom along what he called the road. They took them over to the PP in Pike County in a wagon that is about 37 or 38 miles from here, where they were turned over to the Museys and the Barnetts, also colored. The route, I tell you, was about the regular line. Remember, when you talk about the Underground Railroad, use that railroad language, the regular line. So he was making the implication about that he was part of and he worked with those persons along the Underground Railroad. Next slide. He was a fashionable barber and a hairdresser. A barber and a hairdresser. That means he cut people's hair and he fixed ladies' hair. He did it all. He was a jack of all trades. And in that time, as he's talking to people, he can help the persons get the freedom. He can pass messages because everybody came into the barbershop. So it wouldn't be suspicious that he's getting messages from people. Next slide. And it was on 2nd Street, marketing John J. Minor's barbershop on 2nd Street in 1876. And that's along the Ohio River. It's not that far from the Ohio River where his barbershop was. Next slide. I'm going to show you a map of where it actually is today. That is the location of what was John J. Minor's barbershop on 2nd Street. And I think what's the name of the place that is?
Right next door. The next slide, I think.
Next slide. I can't think of the name of the place. That's the name of the place. Thank you.
Yes. So it's
Pike is right next
two doors.
to
Yeah, two
two
doors
doors
down.
down from Pike's and Patty's and Pike. Excuse me. This is from 5 years ago, but that's where that's a major place too as well.
That's right.
We'll
We'll get to that here in a minute.
We'll get to that here in a minute. Next slide. This is just pointing out that Martha Minor was a member of Allen Chapel. John J. Minor was a barber who also was a member of Allen Chapel. Next slide. Yeah, and we'll go back to this article with Siebert. According to John J. Minor, these black residents of Houston Hollow, I just talked about Houston Hollow, were engaging in assisting with the Underground Railroad. would take them over to PP in Pike County in a wagon to the Museys and the Barnetts. The Barnetts were members of, watch this, Eden Baptist Church, which served the free black community of Pike County, known as PP7. From the Baptist community at PP Freedom Seekers were then taken various routes for the north, which included one that ran to Chillicothe, where First Baptist was the home to a number of black Underground Railroad conductors. That's First Baptist Chillicothe. Next slide. I put this here just to mention that John J. Minor was the first worship master of the lodge here in Portsmouth. He was a part of the Underground Railroad, and what you're finding is a lot of those that were Masons were intricately a part of the Underground Railroad. Next slide.
My grandfather's in that picture.
Oh, okay. Okay. Here we have an article. It comes from Portsmouth Daily Portsmouth Tribune. It's not Daily Times at this point, but Portsmouth Tribune that talks about some slaves being captured that were placed in the Greenup jail. I'm gonna read the article real quick. On Sunday last, 4 slaves belonging to Worthington brother of Greenup County, Kentucky, came to this place and hired a convoy of Mitchell and Macomb. The owners of them, fearing all was not right, started in pursuit in company with 2 other persons. The slaves were overhauled a short distance from town, returned and were handed over to their owners, who placed them in Greenup jail, where they are to be kept until they were sold. The men were instrumental in rescuing them, received a reward of $900, which was a lot back then. That's a lot of money.
And so I'll just add to this confirmed a story that Minor told Seabird about. So we actually were able to have newspaper confirmation. What's the next slide? I forget. Is it okay, go back a slide. Go back to the Seabird interview.
Right. So next slide. Right here.
So yeah, here. So this is the actual original. He says, another time I got 3 others, and we got a hack of George Mitchell to go to a wedding at Piketon, 24 miles away from here. We were overtaken by 4 horsemen at the toll gate. William Cook, colored, my wife, and myself were in with the fugitives. The pursuers were Uriah White, George Mitchell, and Sam Macklin. So it confirmed what was in the newspaper.
Right.
That newspaper report was about this. And it shows that Martha was a conductor too.
She was a conductor too. Not only it was John Jay, it was also Martha Minor as well.
Yes.
Next slide. The movement of Black Baptist places of worship in Portsmouth, 1862 to 2024. Next slide.
So let's see that.
I think we've seen that. Yeah. Let's go to the next slide. Cornerstone. You can go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay. Y'all have seen this picture before. You can go to the next slide. Okay. As we talked about already, we talked about all of these different locations, and we go to the next slide.
Yeah, okay. I'll take it. Okay. All right. So, we were talking about the key role of the Black community, Black churches, the key role of women, both white and Black. What I want to do now is talk about the key role of interracial cooperation and look at some of the other stories and sites that we're marking. Next slide. So when
Y'all get snacks and whenever y'all feel like you got snacks over here.
Oh yeah. Please help yourself. So when the professor from Ohio State came here to Portsmouth, he was actually looking to interview this guy, Milton Kennedy. Um, he had been told by the mayor of Portsmouth that Milton Kennedy had been involved in the Underground Railroad, and he would be a good person to interview. So Siebert came here, but it turned out that Milton Kennedy was out of town. And so it might have been the mayor, it's not really clear, but somebody said, well, since Kennedy's not here, maybe you should talk to John J. Minor. And so that's how we found out everything about John J. Minor and Martha and all of that. Kennedy, though, ultimately wrote a letter to the professor Siebert, and in that letter had additional information that we've been exploring, and it's really been a surprise actually to find out even more about Milton Kennedy, because we ultimately will be able to confirm one of his stories through other sources, newspaper accounts, a really quite dramatic story of huge national historical significance that I'm still, every time I think about it, I'm just kind of shocked by it. Okay, so Kennedy was a grain merchant, steamboat captain here. He built the first three-story building on 2nd Street. It still stands today. It is the Oddfellows restaurant that has recently opened that building. Kennedy is known as the founder of the Republican Party in Scioto County. He's one of them. There are a handful of like the original Republicans, right? Abolitionists. And he also was, he attended the first meeting of the Ohio Republicans. Like he went to the first state convention in Ohio. He also went to the first like convention of like the national, Republican Party. So Milton Kennedy was pretty well connected ultimately, is something that we find out. He becomes friends with Salmon P. Chase, governor of Ohio, future secretary of the Treasury, I believe, under Lincoln. And then he goes on and becomes a Supreme Court justice. But Salmon Chase was one of the early Republicans like Kennedy. Kennedy belonged to a small little church in Portsmouth the nickname was the Rattle Church. It was kind of a splinter sect of Methodists. And they were on 5th Street as well. So if you remember the Black Church, the AME Church was on 5th Street as well. Well, this radical church was also on 5th Street. Okay, go ahead. So in his letter to Siebert, he talked about the times that he had helped freedom seekers, but also he mentioned his brother-in-law, Joseph Ashton, actually claiming that Ashton helped more people than he had. He said, actually, my brother-in-law was the one who really helped more people. But one of the things that Kennedy said was that he worked with a guy named Ed Weaver, a black resident of the city. We've been really frustrated because we can't find Ed Weaver anywhere, like in the census records. So one of the things that we have noticed and learned, though, is that Siebert's records, sometimes he gets people's names spelled wrong. I don't know if that's the case here. Could that be John Q. Weaver? Yes. But there was another black Weaver family in Portsmouth, a guy named Peter Weaver and Charlotte Weaver. Peter and Charlotte, they were members of First Presbyterian Church. So First Pres actually was an integrated congregation early on, and had African American members. But we can't find Ed Weaver. But what we're pointing to here is the importance of interracial cooperation. Okay. So this is from Siebert's notes on his letter, Kennedy's letter. In 1852, Mr. Kennedy was employed on a steamboat. A Negro was brought on board, and Kennedy was directed to take him to Portsmouth, which he did. There he got Ed Weaver, a colored man, to procure him a ticket on the stage. The fugitive reached Canada safely. All right, so that was, this is an advertisement in the Portsmouth paper and the Enquirer from June of 1851. So really close period, same period in time. But this is an advertisement for how you could get from Portsmouth to New York by stage. And you could do it in 52 hours. You could be in New York City. Okay? From Portsmouth to New York City in 52 hours. But this would have been basically the stagecoach, that Ed Weaver would have bought the ticket for the guy to get on, right? So you start to see how the operations actually work. You've got a steamboat captain, guy working on a steamboat. Freedom seeker gets on board over in Kentucky or West Virginia, right? And they bring him to Portsmouth. Okay, they got to hand him off to somebody, right? They know who to hand him off to. Apparently, Ed Weaver. Ed Weaver, African American, So that is that interracial cooperation. Other examples of sort of steamboat escapes. This is a good example, I think, where you can find also interracial cooperation. The escape of a man named Ben on board the steamer Fashion Number 2, 1852. We were able to find this information from a runaway slave advertisement. Okay, so this appeared in a paper, I think a Portsmouth paper, yes, Portsmouth Enquirer, the 16th of January, 1852. $100 reward. Runaway from the subscriber living in Wayne County, Virginia, which is West Virginia today. One Negro man named Ben. He left home on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, day before Christmas, right? And left the mouth of Big Sandy. So the mouth of Big Sandy, the Big Sandy River's mouth is where Catlettsburg is today, right? And then on board the steamer Fashion Number 2 on the 1st of January and went to Portsmouth, where he was last seen. Okay. So we've actually researched who John Wellman was. We've actually figured out where Ben's original escape site was. It's a place called Fort Gay, West Virginia today, across the river from Louisa, Kentucky, which is actually, it's a pretty good distance from there to Catlettsburg. So he somehow managed to get all the way to Catlettsburg and then got on board the steamboat. And the steamboat captain took him to Portsmouth. So here's the Fashion Number 2, being advertised. So it's an advertisement, and so you can actually use this kind of information to figure out about what time it was that that he would have arrived in Portsmouth. And then this is the story of the escape of Jane. So when it comes to freedom seeker, it was much more common for men to run away than women. So the women's stories are really special if you're able to really kind of find the information about them. And there's various reasons why it was less common for women, but mostly it's because of child rearing duties and responsibilities, familial sort of responsibilities that made it much more harder for them to just leave, drop everything and leave. Also, just the physical difficulty involved in escaping, fleeing, maybe having to cross rivers and stuff like that would be pretty intimidating. But this is the story of Jane. We don't have her last name, which is often the case, but she escaped on board the steamer Diana when the Diana docked here in Portsmouth. So, this story we actually do know what the steamboat looked like because there's a famous painting of it because it was in a race with another boat called the Baltic. So it's Diana and the Baltic there. Next slide. So on board was Thomas Brown of Pittsburgh. And Thomas Brown is a documented, known, kind of famous Underground Railroad conductor in Pittsburgh. And he wrote a memoir, and it's not really been published before. You can find a copy of it like at Wilberforce, right? That's where
It's at Afro-Am.
Afro-Am Museum.
National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center over in Wilberforce. They have all the records of Thomas Brown and many other conductors. They have a very large collection.
And they have a photograph of them.
Yes, they do.
So next. So I came across the story when I was reading Keith Griffler's book. So I recommend this book. It's called Frontline of Freedom: African Americans and the Forging of the Underground Railroad in the Ohio Valley. I think that's the full title. So, a good book. But I was just, reading it, and then I came across this passage. Thomas Brown also worked on the Ohio River, from which strategic locale he, like many others, helped enslaved persons escape. Once, while en route from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati on the Diana, he encountered a young girl. Discovering her condition of enslavement, he set to work at once to free her. Dressed her up in the disguise of an old woman in black, replete with veil, Brown first managed to slip her onto a neighboring boat while the Diana put up at Portsmouth, Ohio. He then carried her ashore and passed her to friends who arranged her journey to Canada. Next. All right, and then another escape. This one is of Joshua on board the steamer Bostona that we mentioned before. Briefly, John Quincy Weaver, J.Q. Weaver, had worked as the barber on board the Bostona. So one of the things to think about these steamboats is that they're kind of like a hotel, they'd have a steward on board, often a woman, often it would be an African American woman who was the steward, or a man as the steward. But in some of them, they actually had on board, a barber as well, or the barber might also double as a steward or what have you. But John Q. Weaver came to Portsmouth after he took a job in Cincinnati working on the Bostona as the barber. And the story is that when the Bostona came back upriver, like on its first trip as barber, came to Portsmouth, he got off here and he loved the place and decided to move to Portsmouth. And so that's how John Q. Weaver came to Portsmouth on board the Bostona, working for Captain McLean, right? Who we did in 1855, the same year that he helped Joshua escape.
And one of the things I want to point out, I don't have any evidence to prove this, but I think some of the our African American community are running enslaved.
Yep. Yes.
I don't have evidence
Oh,
to prove that. I'm sure some of the families here are running enslaved.
I have no doubt.
That escaped from Fremont. Like I said, I don't have any evidence to prove any of that.
Yep.
I'm pretty confident it is. So that Joshua is good story to look at.
So William McLean, builder, owner, captain of the steamer Bostona, was at the time of Joshua's escape. He escaped from Vanceburg, basically got on board the Bostona at Vanceburg, Kentucky. That's like across from Buena Vista. right there at the Adams-Sauter County line. So it's kind of like it's the closest village on the Kentucky side downriver from Portsmouth.
Yeah.
It would be sort of like the last stop if you were heading upriver before you got to Portsmouth. Okay, so McLean's coming up the river, picks up people at Vanceburg. Among the people he picks up is Joshua. A little bit on his background. McLean was actually new to Portsmouth at this time as well, 1855. It's about like he built the boat and then he moved to Portsmouth. I think he built it down in Cincinnati and then he brought it up and put it in service between Cincinnati and Portsmouth. But he moved to Portsmouth perhaps because of his wife. Because his wife's sister, in other words, McLean's sister-in-law, was a woman named Amanda Purcell. And Amanda Purcell is famous locally because she started the Soldiers' Aid Society at the beginning of the Civil War here in Portsmouth. And she's responsible for basically starting Memorial Day services in Portsmouth. And there's a good argument that Portsmouth has one of the earliest Memorial Day anniversaries services in all the United States. There's even a claim that I won't support the claim, but I think it's a pretty good claim that it may even have been the first. And that claim has been made that Purcell was the woman who did that. Greenlawn, the Friends of Greenlawn, just installed a historical marker to Amanda Purcell in Greenlawn. So that was McLean's sister-in-law. We don't have any evidence that Purcells were engaged in Underground Railroad activity. But, we don't have evidence for a lot of people that were involved in Underground Railroad activity. The National Park Service, though, demands that we only list stuff that there is hard evidence for. The owner of Joshua, her name was Eliza Isham. She sued McLean, and the jury ruled in her favor, awarding her $1,500 in damages, which the jury said was the value of a skilled carpenter slave. Because Joshua was a skilled carpenter, and she let him hire himself out. They were supposed to pay her own, his owner, and she let him kind of go about working like that, and that's how he was able to basically escape. Okay, next. And this brings us back to Milton Kennedy and this incredible story of the Piketon 55. Okay, next. April 1862. Civil War has been going on for almost a year, not quite. In one of the early campaigns, it's known as the Big Sandy Valley campaign. And the Big Sandy River, right, is what runs between Kentucky and Virginia, or West Virginia. And in the latter part of 61 into early 62, some Confederate forces that come up from Virginia into eastern Kentucky, into the Big Sandy Valley. And so U.S. Armed Forces then were sent to lead this campaign, the Big Sandy Valley campaign, to push the Confederates back out of eastern Kentucky. And what happens is that Union troops, as they go down into the valley, African Americans escaping from their slave owners and running over to Union lines, seeking freedom, seeking liberty. And this is before the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, so the Federal Army couldn't enlist them. They couldn't just bring them into the Army. A lot of the men wanted to join the fight. But you got to also think of these were women and children as well. They were sort of like refugees running running away for freedom. So this is going to be a problem for the U.S. commanders, the Union commanders, because some of them are running away from Kentucky slave owners, and Kentucky is still in the Union. I mean, they're not Confederates, so they're loyal quote unquote masters that these folks are running away from. Federal law was that the fugitive slave law, right, was that you had to return the runaway to the owner. That was federal law. Okay, so the Union Army finds themselves in a difficult position about what to do, right? Because some of those officers are abolitionists. Some of them are former Underground Railroad operators, and they've got freedom seekers coming into their camp. So what do you do? What do you do about that? So that's what happens when James A. Garfield, future president of the United States, leads the Union forces down into the Big Sandy Valley. So this is from about the same time period, but it depicts freedom seekers coming into federal camp. So that would be like what we're talking about. Okay. Next. The military operations in the Big Sandy campaign were the headquarters for the operations were established in Catlettsburg. So right there at the mouth of the Big Sandy, Catlettsburg, Kentucky, which is the county seat of Boyd County today. And so this is the Ohio River right here, right? And then this would be the Big Sandy coming into the Ohio. Next. And so if you go there today, you can find a historical marker, the U.S. post located here for the Big Sandy campaign. In the winter of 61 and 60, troops under Colonel James A. Garfield, later 20th President of the U.S., drove Confederate States of America from area by victory at Mill Creek. So about a block or so away from this is actually where the riverboat landing is, the steamboat landing for Catlettsburg, which is where we're going to place the marker. Right, so Garfield was in command of these different units, the 14th Kentucky, the 16th Kentucky, the 22nd Kentucky, 40th and 42nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Garfield's house up in northern Ohio was just last year put on the National Network to Freedom, recognizing the former president's involvement in Underground Railroad activity. And so the National Park Service already had Garfield on their radar when we brought this to them, and they were like, wow. Wow. Okay, so Garfield selects Ralph Plum and Jacob Heaton, two noted abolitionists with documented ties to the Underground Railroad, to be his quartermaster and his commissary of subsistence. So those are the two titles that Plum and Heaton have. Next slide. So the quartermaster is this guy, Ralph Plum. And, if you were alive at this time, you would have been like, oh, Ralph Plum, I think I've heard of him. Is that guy that got charged by the federal government for rescuing a captured slave that federal marshals had in their custody? Yeah, that Ralph Plum, that abolitionist up from Oberlin, right? He got charged by the federal government for actually rescuing successfully a freedom seeker. So that was back in 1858. 37 of them were arrested for violating the law, Ralph Plum among them. So it was Ralph Plum, the quartermaster, who signed a contract with Milt Kennedy to transport military supplies and troops on Kennedy's steamboat, the Piketon, during the Big Sandy campaign. He had a couple different contracts. Another one would have been from the commissary of subsistence, Jacob Heaton. So, and these contracts actually exist we've seen copies of it. Okay, next. Okay, so Jacob Heaton, commissary of subsistence, also signed contracts with Kennedy. The Heaton is like one of the big time Underground Railroad operators, right? More than 200 came through his house, which is really a huge number, in Salem, Ohio. He also was really well connected with the abolitionist movement. He kept like a guest book for people that came to his house. Frederick Douglass. Okay, like, I mean, that guy was tied in with like the hardcore of the abolitionist movement. So Garfield hires this guy, right, and Plum to be his quartermaster and commissary of subsistence. And they turn around and they hire Milton Kennedy. Okay. Next. So sometimes, like, the history is right under your nose and you don't know how to interpret it or know what you have. I've been studying Milton Kennedy for 10 years or more. And I had read his interview with Siebert a number of times, but I didn't read it right, oddly. In his interview, he talks about how he helped a couple, he worked with Ed Weaver and helped that guy get on the stagecoach. And then it says, later on, Kennedy brought 55 Negroes down the Big Sandy and landed them at Portsmouth, where many of them remain. Because he said later on, I wasn't really sure what he was talking. I thought, well, maybe he's talking about after the war. Because, like, how do you bring 55 people? Like, what? Anyways, I thought he was talking about after the war. We couldn't find any other reference to it, or and I kind of had that in the back of my head, like, that Portsmouth black community, some of them were brought here by Kennedy. That was just what I thought. And anyways, I get a text from one of our outreach specialists. He's working on Catlettsburg, and you go to the next slide. And she says, she sends me a little quote. It's from a speech in the United States Senate by a Kentucky senator. And the senator says that 45 slaves of loyal masters in northern Kentucky were taken under government contract on a steamboat through Catlettsburg and taken to Ohio. She asked me if that sounded familiar. White woman. That sounds like what Milton Kennedy said. And so went back to it, and my gosh, that's exactly what it was. And we were able then to go find the newspaper article that verified all of it. So you go to the next slide. So in the newspaper collection that we have at Shawnee State that was donated to us by the Portsmouth Daily Times, we have newspapers going all the way back to the 1820s. But so we went back to the April '62 because we knew the time period, right, from the campaign and all that. And right there, the headline: Ohio becoming Africanized. The steamer piped in. Captain Kennedy, engaged in the government service, brought down from Western Virginia on Tuesday last 55 Negroes represented to be free. And these are reported to be the first installment. And I will say that the article is just horribly racist. And the full article is there. But what the Times ends up doing is calling on the state legislature to pass a law to make it illegal for African Americans to settle in Ohio,
Comes from black laws.
which is like bringing, well, taking the black laws to a whole new level, right? Where there's an actual ban on African Americans moving and settling in Ohio. That bill was introduced and was voted on. The guy that introduced it was the representative from Scioto County, and it got voted down. So I mean, there was an impact, right? I mean, Kennedy bringing a large group of freedom seekers to Portsmouth, it actually caused a bit of a backlash. We also found additional reporting that they were placed on a train in Portsmouth and taken to Jackson. And then the report, then we found another report from Jackson that said they were run out of Jackson and were headed to Canada. Now again, the date of all this is important because it's all before the Emancipation Proclamation. Right? So, these really were, freedom seekers. They had not been emancipated. I think the National Park Service was pretty excited about this. And it really adds to our understanding of that period of the Civil War with the contraband before the Emancipation Proclamation. But it also really makes Portsmouth a much more significant place historically, as when it comes to resistance to slavery, the Underground Railroad, its ultimate abolition. So there's the Senator Lazarus Powell, right? So this is what he said. They were taken in a government steamboat which passed Catlettsburg in Kentucky to Ohio and turned them loose. By order of those in command of the post somewhere on the Big Sandy. Like they weren't sure who gave the order, right? And actually we don't know who gave the order because we don't have a record of it. Was Garfield directly involved? Don't know. Jacob Heaton, was Ralph Plum? Probably. We also think that they probably picked up the freedom seekers as they were withdrawing from the valley. So the campaign ended basically like around the end of or the beginning of April. Yeah. So we think that it was his last trip, basically, when they brought them to Portsmouth. Okay. Thanks. All right. So I'm going to hand things over to Wesley, who's been working on our First Presbyterian story.
Well, hi, I'm Wesley Vanderweg. I am an Ohio History Service Corps member, and as a part of my services to Drew and Center for Public History, I have been tasked to do research on the First Presbyterian Church in Portsmouth. So, First Presbyterian Church in Portsmouth was founded in 1817, but I'll talk a little bit beforehand. There were Presbyterians in Portsmouth, probably as early as shortly after the founding of Portsmouth, to be honest. But in that early time, they didn't have a formal church to practice at. And there was really no church close by in the region until you went to maybe Manchester. That probably was one of the closer churches. But so what they did is they had pastors from other Presbyterian churches come to Portsmouth and hold services in people's houses. And the big idea about this is the people who came over are very influential in the Presbyterian Church. So you had people like Reverend James Gilliland, who was the pastor at Red Oak Presbyterian Church, which was a very, very heavily anti-slavery congregation there. You had William Williamson, who was the pastor at West Union, and then also later at Manchester. He was also an abolitionist. And he was a big abolitionist over in Adams County, and assisted with his wife in the escape of a few slaves themselves. And then you also had Robert G. Wilson, which is the pastor. He was the pastor of First Presbyterian Church up in Chillicothe, which was a very heavily anti-slavery Presbyterian congregation up there. And all three of these people worked together in the past to try to change the Presbyterian Church. They even sent letters with a group of like-minded individuals from the Chillicothe Presbytery to get the Presbyterian Church to address the issue of slavery. Say, we don't want to have communion with people that believe that slavery is okay. So that's one of the things that they were doing. And these are the three people who visited Portsmouth before the founding of First Presbyterian Church. So from the very beginning of the foundation of First Presbyterian Church, they had heavily anti-slavery abolitionist beliefs instilled to them with those pastors. So the first church was built in 1817. The first pastor was Reverend Stephen Lindsley. And I don't really have too much information about his stance on slavery itself. But one of the other important things about the founding of First Pres is that for the first 5 years, 1817 to about 1825-ish, First Presbyterian Church practiced at two locations. They practiced at Sandy Springs, which is near the edge of Adams County, and then they also practiced at Portsmouth. Their first location was the courthouse in Market Street, actually, which was shared by a bunch of different churches at the time period. So they practiced there, and then they practiced at a location in Sandy Springs. It's really important to remember that Sandy Springs later on develops an anti-slavery society of its own in 1836. And some of the members that joined First Presbyterian Church really early on, like Moses Baird, and then later on his son and his wife, they become members, like Moses Baird and then another member, Sema Baird, become members of that anti-slavery society in Sandy Springs. So from the earliest foundations of the church, you have members who have abolitionist belief. The current church is built in 1851, which is kind of a leap. They did have a secondary location that was built. I do not remember the exact location, but it was built on 1840.
It was on 2nd Street.
2nd Street. It was on 2nd Street, built in 1840. And then they moved, kind of similar to, they moved further west, further east. Next slide. So some of the most influential members of the church, really, one of the most influential members was Joseph Riggs. And Joseph Riggs was a very influential abolitionist, and he really did not make an attempt to hide his abolitionism. He was actually a member of the Anti-Slavery Society in Ohio. Before he came to First Presbyterian Church in about the 1830s, he was a member of the Anti-Slavery Society, and he also was a manager in Lawrence County, which is where he lived shortly before coming to Portsmouth. So there's an account in Sieber's records that talks about Joseph Riggs supplying financial aid to James Ashley, who is a very huge abolitionist in Portsmouth. He's a name that everyone will honestly probably should know. And he actually is the one who introduced the 13th Amendment into Congress up in Toledo. But before he did all of that, he assisted in the escape of slaves from Kentucky and other places down south. Riggs somehow knew that James Ashley was involved in the Underground Railroad activity. How he knew, well, we'll get to that in just a little bit. But he knew this. And he knew that James was going to need money to make his venture successful. So, I'll read the record. Rewards of $100 piece for the capture of 5 slaves was offered. When young Ashley went over to the Ohio River on the Ohio side to prospect and around and learn whether they had suspected anybody, he met Joseph Riggs, a local merchant in Portsmouth, who took a $20 gold piece from his pocket and gave it to him, saying, "James, you may need this." So he slipped him some cash. That's a significant, $20 was a significant sum back then. And how did Joseph know that James Ashley was involved in the Underground Railroad? Because James Ashley wasn't a Presbyterian. Joseph Riggs is a very significant figure in Portsmouth in general. He was a successful businessman. He served as county recorder several times, and he was involved in the building of many significant ventures like bridges. Hocking-Sino Valley Railroad was also founded in part by Joseph Riggs. So he's a major player, and a lot of people knew who he was in town. So he was familiar. He was definitely familiar with James Ashley. But how did he know about his Underground Railroad activity?
Yeah.
We'll have to go back. Circle back to this one. We'll go
All right, next one. Okay.
One more.
Is that it? Okay.
I'm trying to go to the Ashley part of it.
Is that it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So James Ashley, right? He was one of the most infamous, Underground Railroad conductors. He was born in Pittsburgh. He moved to Portsmouth as a young boy. As a young man, Ashley worked with an African American man who was enslaved in Greenup County to deliver freedom seekers from the Ohio River to a network of operators inside the county. In the late 1840s and early 1850s, Ashley lived in the household of Samuel and Elizabeth Houston at the corner of 4th and 2nd Streets, location of Caddies and Pines. Now, where was First Presbyterian Church in 1840? On 2nd Street. Where was the location of First Presbyterian Church in 1850? On 3rd and 4th Street. Very nearby.
Yeah.
And really important to remember the Houston name. Susanna Houston, which is the mother of Samuel Houston, was one of the earliest members of First Presbyterian Church. She was an old Quaker. She came to Portsmouth really early on. And in 1817, when the founding of the church happened, she was one of the first people to be baptized in First Presbyterian Church. And her being a Quaker leads all of us to believe that she had anti-slavery tendencies. Right? She would have lived at that same residence with Samuel and Elizabeth Houston. So she would have been very familiar with who James Ashley was and what he did. Now, we don't have any official records saying this, but one of the likelihoods of how Joseph Riggs would have found out about James Ashley's activities would have been from Susanna Houston. She would have passed word saying, "Oh, well, Joseph's in need of some money today." Then he circled back and then went ahead and gave James Ashley some money. So that's the official evidence that we've been able to compile for Riggs's connection. I've done extensive research on Riggs genealogically as well, and Riggs comes from a family that is very heavily involved with abolitionists, very heavily involved with Presbyterian ministers. And his family, so his mom, Annie Baird, and his dad, Stephen Baird, when they move from their family home, they leave and they go to Ripley. They then attend John Rankin's church, John Rankin's Presbyterian Church, along with their son, Stephen Return Riggs. Stephen Return Riggs becomes a reverend, and he goes to Ripley College under John Rankin. Stephen Return Riggs later on becomes a minister that goes to the Sioux tribe out in the Dakotas. Before he does this, he joins the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. So not only is Joseph Riggs a member of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society, his brother, Stephen Riggs, is a member of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. Some of Joseph's other relatives like Moses Baird, is actually a relative of Joseph Riggs, because his mother is Annie Baird. Annie Baird's brother is Moses. Moses Baird is one of the earliest members of the First Presbyterian Church congregation, and he lived in Sandy Springs. And he later joined the Sandy Springs Anti-Slavery Society. So you have multiple instances within the same family where they have abolitionist activities and abolitionist ideals. Moses Baird's son, his name is Chambers Baird. Chambers Baird becomes a very influential individual in Ripley. He becomes a, I believe, judge after his father, who was also a judge. He was heavily involved in the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. So you have father like son, and Chambers Baird was the cousin of Stephen Riggs. And they went to school together in Ripley, at Ripley College. So to circle back to get off of all the genealogical connections, all those genealogical connections influence Joseph's upbringing, and they influence his abolitionism. But to circle back to what's on the screen right now, First Presbyterian Church during the, which I don't necessarily know when it was completely founded. I would assume that First Presbyterian Church always had a ladies' society within the church. The earliest records of that have most likely been destroyed either by a fire or by a flood. Most likely it's been one of the floods that knocked out some of those records. But this is the earliest record that they have at the church. It's from 1849 to about 1852. And you'll notice the names on that. Mrs. Riggs, they met at Mrs. Riggs' house, and Mrs. Riggs was the vice president. So this right here on the screen is the records of the Ladies Sewing Society. And we've done some research. Their ladies sewing societies in Cincinnati were involved in the Underground Railroad activities. In Cincinnati, there's record in Levi Coffin, by Levi Coffin, and in the Wilbur Siebert collection, there's record of that ladies sewing society creating garments, assisting with the care and transition of runaways on the Underground Railroad. We do not have that record within this. This just generally says who attended the meeting, who created which garments, that kind of thing, and like some financial records. However, the existence of this sewing society and the existence of one in Cincinnati is very close geographically. To be honest, it's close enough, and the purposes are so similar, and the actual people who were members of this society, Mrs. Riggs, that's Joseph's wife. Joseph's wife was also an abolitionist, Rebecca Gibson Baldridge Riggs. Now, Rebecca Baldridge Riggs, last name being Baldridge, her father was Reverend William Baldridge, who was a pastor up in Cherry Fork. So that was the congregation that Joseph and Rebecca originally went to when they had just recently got married in Adams County. So he's the pastor of Cherry Fork and Tranquility Associate Reformed Presbyterian Churches, and he held abolitionist beliefs as well. So not only was Joseph raised in an abolitionist-heavy environment, Rebecca Baldridge Riggs was also raised in an abolitionist environment. And Tranquility was a hotbed of abolitionist activity, along with the John T. Wilson homestead. So that influenced Rebecca Baldridge Riggs' actions at First Presbyterian Church, and she was one of the leaders of the Ladies Sewing Society. So a lot of meetings were held at her house, and her children were also very heavily involved, Eliza Jane Riggs and Martha Riggs. So she moved.
I was just going to add,
the the oral tradition within the church
Yes.
is that the sewing society was directly involved
Yes.
in Underground Railroad activity, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Those are the oral traditions of the church, passed down by members through the congregation over time, is that the Ladies' Aid Society, which also could be the Ladies' Sewing Society, this is just the name that they had on the record, otherwise known as the Ladies' Aid Society. Ladies' Aid Society was a organization that assisted slaves and assisted them in giving them clothing, giving them shelter, providing them what they needed, and the training that they needed to hold their head high in order to pass as a free black person and to move further on the Underground Railroad. So that is the oral tradition, and one of the key members who would have been involved in this is actually Peter Weaver's wife, Charlotte Weaver. Charlotte Weaver would have been instrumental in that process. Talking a little bit about Peter and Charlotte Weaver, Drew mentioned them earlier. Peter Weaver was a former slave. He was born in Virginia, and he purchased his freedom, and then he was also married. He was married to Charlotte, who was also enslaved in Kentucky. He later purchased her freedom, and then they moved to Portsmouth. They were one of the earliest residents in Portsmouth. In Nelson Evans, he states that they have a log cabin or something, like a log cabin structure, one of the earliest in Portsmouth. And Peter Weaver, in the census record of like 1860, it states that he was 117 years old in 1860. So he was one of the earliest, and he was the oldest resident inside the county at that time when he passed away in 1860. So he would have been alive for all of this abolitionist activity. And that is proven. He is involved in the church. He went to the church. The details of the Underground Railroad activity. So this is through the oral tradition. This is where they would hide the slaves when they would come to the First Presbyterian Church. This is the entryway to the actual current church. It was 1851. So if you enter through the front, you'll have a staircase going both left and right. There are doors at both sides. So that is where they would stash freedom seekers. And there used to be like a large bookshelf or something. They would move in front of that. So if like slave catchers would try to come up and try to look through things, there would be a lot of heavy furniture that they would not want to move out of the way. Or it would look like there wouldn't be a door behind there. So they were very good at concealing it. Inside that little room, there's a little light, and there is a section that has been hollowed out of brick, and the brick at that church is like soft brick, so they can actually light a fire in there and keep themselves warm and actually cook food in there too. So this is all from the oral tradition of the church, and to be honest, when you go in there, you can see how they would actually have hid them. But Peter and Charlotte Weaver, Peter purchased his wife for $1,000 back then, which is a huge sum of money. He borrowed $1,000 to purchase his wife Charlotte, purchase her freedom. They left behind their child in slavery. They could not purchase their child, so I do not know. We do not have records of what happened to the child, but they had to leave them behind in slavery. But Peter and Charlotte, having experienced the institution of slavery themselves, would have been undoubtedly involved in the Underground Railroad activity of the church. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that. But they were not the only black members of First Presbyterian Church. There was a newspaper article that we have found in our research that talks about Abigail Kramer Lucas.
Oh,
And it talks about Abigail Kramer Lucas in Jefferson Township in Sutton County. That article states there were 12 African American members of First Presbyterian Church in 1840. Now we've identified 3 of them Peter, Charlotte, and then another member named Elizabeth Thomas, which I haven't really been able to find too much information about. The other 9 I have not been able to identify. But the fact that there was the African American, congregation within First Presbyterian Church shows that, as Antonio and as everyone has all been saying, the importance of interracial cooperation is facilitated at First Presbyterian Church.
Excellent.
So that is the residence of James Ashley. That's the Houston corner. That also would be where Susanna Houston and her son Samuel Houston would live.
Right.
Okay.
So, when the National Park Service is going to be here later in June, we're going to take them to a lot of these sites. We had discussed marking the Steamboat Riverfront, put a marker there, but because we have only a limited number, basically we had to decide for this phase, do we mark James Ashley's residence or do we mark the riverfront? And we're actually positioned to really mark either one, and we're waiting on feedback from the National Park Service about what they really want us to do. But marking the riverfront with the whole new riverfront redevelopment that is going on with that big state grant of $34 million, we're waiting for final confirmation that there was money in that for a new mural. But the governor did say, when he announced it, that it included a new mural. So we're cautiously optimistic, but the city hasn't received the official agreement that says exactly what's paid for and what's not. But it sounds like that the funding is there for the Black History mural that has been discussed, which would include some depiction of the Underground Railroad in it as part of that. So the idea would then be to have the interpretive marker there interpreting Portsmouth as a destination, with steamboat escapes and other crossings at Portsmouth. Frankly, it's really how can you pick between, the guy that was a conductor here locally who went on to introduce the legislation that abolished slavery in the United States. That's James Ashley, right? Probably one of the most influential abolitionist Underground Railroad operators from the whole tri-state. You mark that, or do you mark the riverfront, right? It's but we want to mark Pleasant Green, we want to mark Allen Chapel, right? So what our plan is to get the feedback from the National Park Service about what they think we should mark first. Should we mark the location of James Ashley, or should we do the riverfront? And some days I wake up thinking we got to do the riverfront, and some days I wake up thinking, how could you not mark James Ashley? So I would love if we have some discussion and your thoughts on that as well. So I think that wraps it up. So thank you for sharing this time with us, and we're happy to answer questions. And again, I would invite people to get some refreshments. Thank you.
I'm gonna at least leave a little time for any questions. I know we have shown you a lot today. There's a lot to process, but I know there's some burning questions that those who here are having. I want you to go ahead and ask those questions now. We've been working really, really hard in the last year, almost year and a half now. Get where we are on this process. So I want to leave room for you to ask any questions. about anything that we've done, any other research that we've done.
Can you go back to the photo? Because I would like to know, I would like to see. Because that
Which photo was it?
it was so defined. It's under different, yeah, it was amazing.
Oh, on the yeah the
And that's gonna take a little bit minute. So while I'm trying to get to it, I want to see if anybody else have any questions. It's gonna take a little minute to get there.
Actually, Antonio, you can go to the middle and select the slide number.
Where?
if you exit the
Picture right up top,
oh there right there.
like that, and you can go back to.
Okay, I didn't know that. I didn't know that option was there.
I'm guessing it's probably a little later, maybe like 80.
Okay. Well, yeah. See, I didn't know that. You showed me something new, man.
Yes.
Is it any way possible you can do some research on all of the American churches? The church that my family is from, he just said it was established in 1920. I don't know if they would have anything to do with our revenue or anything like that. Which church is that? Emmanuel Tabernacle Baptist. It's right across the street, across the track. He said it's established in 1920.
Yeah. Well, I would argue that really all these later churches ultimately grew out of Allen Chapel and Pleasant Green. The histories of the church, that's looking in the newspapers is probably the best way to go about trying to track
Accent does he have?
other than what the church records have themselves.
I'm trying to remember which.
Usually, like when there's an anniversary, there's like a program,
Like
and
60.
there'll be like a little bit of the history. So if there's any of
I
those
can't
small
remember.
programs,
Maybe a little further.
That's on the corner, that building is an old building. On Plymouth Street, it was United Methodist, I think before that, it might have been Plymouth Street, CME.
yeah, it
It's called
was
Methodist
right,
Episcopal.
right,
A
right.
lot of people don't know that, because they had the church history, they never mentioned that, I think that might be.
Sounds
I think
similar to
we're
the
in
A&E church, but it's a different denomination.
Of course, they're not there, they all merged with,
Unfortunately.
a lot of oldest too.
Was that congregation integrated? What'd you say? I mean, was it
At first,
then?
no, but the 19, in the 1970, before they had a white pastor, might be the first white pastor they had, Reverend Hill. And before that, it was all, it was, I think it was a CME, Howard Methodist Episcopal Church.
I didn't get a chance to talk about the pastors.
Not Houston Hall. Then they could come to Portsmouth, where they told to leave there. You know, Botech bought all that land out there.
Yeah.
I say you did a great job.
It's kind
You
of
did a great job.
Talk
about all
that. A lot of the older ones,
A lot.
long here, Grandma Hill. She's
Yeah.
in Reed's in the early 70s. She's in her 90s. Not hers.
Some of the,
Hansons, Lucases. They all were out there when they moved.
one of Joseph Reed's daughters, Mary.
There's sort of two questions. There's like where did that community originate?
That's like J.B. Robinson's son. J.B. Robinson worked.
Part of that is
George
probably
Davis.
with the white Lucas family that moved here, freed their slaves,
That's like what Davis
settled up
station
out, like here in Lucasville, right? Now the other question that was contributing to that was when in 1831, when enforcement officials
Maybe like 85?
enforced the black
I can't remember off the top of my
laws,
head where
a large
that was.
black community that didn't have neighbors. And so I think that contributed to the community. But then your question about moving back probably has a lot to do with jobs and yeah, and right, not being able to make a living farming out there.
It's like Portsmouth, West Side, they have people like
Right.
I like 50 or 60 pounds on that.
Like Union Mills, or what's called Union Mills. Okay. Okay.
Is there any other questions or anything? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay.
The article in the Times about the blacks being brought to the big city. Did you check any other newspapers at the time? Did they not cover that?
I would say that we did look, because we were trying to figure out what the senator had read. Because the senator was working off news reports. He said, like, I read in the papers, and a colleague from Kentucky in the House of Representatives told me about it as well. That's what he says in his speech. So we did look, but we didn't find a bunch of reporting on it. Yeah. There may be more out there, we just haven't found it. Thank you, Gary. See you.
You too. See y'all. Okay. Huh?
I gotta go sing around. I got to switch over my phone.
Okay. I'm trying to find it.
I think you're getting close.
I tell him to
Yeah, fill out the article. One.
It was Martha Lemon. There it is.
There it is.
That's Mr. Fred Miller, of course, Pleasant Green Baptist Church. The lady that was over the center, Miss Haley.
Ah,
Mr. Battle, Allen Chapel, AME. I don't know him. That's my grandfather. He was from Alabama, Gilbertown, Choctaw County. Mr. Lane, Allen Chapel, AME Church. Colonel James, I didn't know he even went to church. Maybe Randy. School teacher, Miss Dorothy Taylor. Miss Berkeley. Miss Fanny Tyson. Right there. Coach Clayton, he's had a lot to do with the black schools here, Washington School. Ronald Parker, policeman. Yeah, Fanny Tyson. Let me see. Ambrosia Edwards, Pleasant Green. Miss Scott, Dr. Scott's wife. Yeah, Ambrosia Edwards here, Pleasant Green. Nessa Haley, I forget Nessa Haley.
Dr. Scott was a member as well?
No, but these
Dr. Scott was a member
were
of Pleasant
different
Green.
churches. Here's Allen Chapel, but these were the Masonic Lodge with the Eastern Star, and a lot of them were different churches, but they met at Pleasant Green. That where this was Mr. Berkeley. He was a teacher.
That's really a who's who.
You start writing down
Some
some
of them I
names.
know, and some of them I don't know. The majority of them I don't know a lot of them. They were older then, but some of them lived, like he lived to my time, and his names and Colonel James and Mr. Lane, that's Kathleen Battle's father, Grady Battle. Miss Taylor, that was my second grade teacher. Miss Berkeley ran the center after Miss Jean Haley. I worked for her. Mr. Clayton, a lot of them I knew. And there's Mr. Melvin. He was a big shot in the community from Allen Chapel. That's them, but that has to be probably about 1944, 42.
You have to say, what year do you think that was?
In the early 40s.
Yeah,
My
it's in the
grandfather, he
40s.
left here in 1942. Yeah, 42 or 43, and went to Alliance, Ohio, to work in the steel mills. He was from Choctaw County, Alabama. I had that picture on my phone. That's why I know it.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? I'm gonna go around and poll the audience now. That's what I do. Keith, you have any questions? You got any questions? You have any questions? Anybody back here have any questions?
Well, how about that question about marking, you know, if we have 4 markers, we mark the steamboat landing, or do we mark Ashland? Now, we're gonna get more funding eventually.
I like to see Ashland Park.
Or the steamboat landing for, you know, or James Ashley does.
Like the riverfront project, it's like they would do their own market when they mark that themselves, all that money they're getting.
Well, usually all the money's earmarked, you know, like it's not, you know, like it's not in the original proposal. So, I believe that there'll be another round of funding that we can do. So.
So if the city got 34 million, kind of making.
Yeah.
And I hope it's really nice, 'cause that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
I hope it's
Yes.
nice.
Yeah. It better be.
I've seen them when they did
So we
that.
need housing.
It's-
Well, they said someone was supposed to be doing it. That's what I heard now.
Of course, because we need housing, of course. We
Yeah.
got a lot of recovery things, but
Yeah.
I think, where am I gonna live at?
Right.
Well, that's all, we need housing. We got enough recovery. Should nobody force to be on drugs, we got plenty of recovery.
Is he lying? He ain't lying.
Everybody should be recovered, but this is the capital. People coming from Chicago, St. Louis, and New York, just a little portion. So everybody should be recovered here. We need housing.
I ain't doing nothing. Man,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
We're standing here.
That's weird.
Well, we want to say thank you for everybody attending. Thank you for those who have been on social media and those who are going to join us later on for this presentation. But thank you so much. Let's give our presenters a hand clap of praise on this.